Imagine being accused of a crime in the Middle Ages. No lawyer, no fair trial. Just chains, cold stone, and the torturer's smile. In this world, pain wasn't a crime, it was the law. Before we uncover the most terrifying torture devices ever used, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more dark history, and drop a comment. Which torture do you think was the worst? Now, let's step inside the dungeon. Picture this. You are dragged into a dim stone chamber, the air damp with the smell of mold and smoke. At the center of the room stands a long wooden frame with rollers at both ends. Heavy ropes hang from its sides like silent threats. You've heard whispers of it before the rack, an invention so cruel it could transform a living person into something unrecognizable. The rack was one of the most infamous torture devices of the Middle Ages. Its design was deceptively simple. A rectangular wooden bed long enough to fit a human body, with 2 rollers on either side. The victim's wrists were tied to one end, the ankles to the other. Then came the torturer's roll, slowly turning the handles, winding the ropes tighter and tighter. Inch by inch, the prisoner's body was pulled apart. At first, the pain came as sharp tension in the muscles. But as the torturer kept cranking, joints dislocated with sickening cracks, tendons tore, ligaments ripped, and bones sometimes snapped under the unnatural pressure. The body, designed to move with fluid motion, was forced into the impossible. Victims would scream until their voices broke or faint from shock, only to be revived with cold water so the torture could continue. Why the rack was used. The rack was not always meant to kill, though many did die upon it. Its purpose was to extract confessions, force names of supposed accomplices, or simply to punish in the most dramatic way possible. In an age where written evidence was scarce and truth was often what the authorities demanded, pain was considered a reliable path to confession. The more someone suffered, the more likely they were to admit guilt, even if innocent. Authorities understood this well. That's why the rack was reserved for serious accusations: treason, witchcraft, heresy, or political crimes. If a peasant was caught stealing grain, they might be whipped or put in the stocks. But if a noble was accused of plotting against the king, or a scholar was suspected of heretical writings, they might find themselves stretched upon the rack, their bodies used as both punishment and spectacle. Famous cases. The rack was notorious in England during the Tudor period. It was even nicknamed the Duke of Exeter's daughter, after the official who introduced it to the Tower of London. Many prisoners accused of treason under Henry VIII or Elizabeth I faced the rack. Some left broken, crippled for life. Others never left at all. One of the most chilling aspects was that survivors often bore permanent deformities: shoulders dislocated beyond repair, arms or legs elongated unnaturally, spines twisted. In a sense, their broken bodies became living reminders of royal authority, the psychology of fear beyond physical pain. The rack was psychological warfare. Prisoners waiting their turn could hear the screams echoing down the corridors of the dungeon. They knew exactly what awaited them. Sometimes simply bringing a prisoner into the torture chamber and showing them the device was enough to extract a confession without even touching the ropes. Fear itself was often the most effective weapon. Public knowledge. Although tortures usually took place in dungeons, stories of the rack spread quickly through towns and villages. Word of its horrors was enough to keep people obedient. After all, who would dare question a law or challenge a king if the price was being pulled apart, joint by joint? End of the rack. By the 17th century, torture as a legal practice began to decline in much of Europe. Enlightenment thinkers questioned whether pain could ever reveal truth, but the legend of the rack lived on. Even today, the very word rack evokes images of brutal suffering. The rack showed how the Middle Ages turned pain into power. It wasn't just about breaking bodies, it was about breaking wills, forcing obedience, and ruling through fear. This was only the beginning. The rack may have stretched bodies to their limits, but the Middle Ages had far darker inventions and store devices meant not just to punish, but to humiliate, terrify, and even destroy a person's very identity. The Iron Maiden is one of those devices that has captured the imagination of countless people who hear about medieval torture. It appears in movies and dark stories told to terrify, and in the minds of those who wonder just how cruel the Middle Ages could be. The image is unforgettable. A tall, coffin-shaped cabinet made of iron, big enough to fit a human body, with two heavy doors that could close shut around the victim. On the inside, countless spikes waited like silent executioners. Once the doors closed, the victim would be trapped in a prison of steel and sharp points, their body pierced from all directions. Not killed instantly, but held in place, bleeding and forced to endure pain until death slowly claimed them. But the truth of the Iron Maiden is not as simple as the legend makes it seem. Some historians argue that it may never have been widely used in the Middle Ages, that it was instead a creation of later centuries, assembled from earlier descriptions and bits of real medieval devices to shock and horrify audiences. Yet even if the Iron Maiden itself was partly myth, the idea it represents the combination of imprisonment and piercing pain captures the very essence of how medieval torture was remembered and imagined. The supposed design of the Iron Maiden was both ingenious and terrifying. The coffin-like structure stood upright, sometimes as tall as a man, with a rounded top like a sarcophagus. Its outside was decorated with faces, carvings, or even inscriptions, but the true horror lay within. Rows of sharp spikes were set at just the right angles so that when a body was placed inside and the doors closed, the victim would not be killed instantly. The spikes were long enough to puncture flesh, but short enough to avoid striking vital organs immediately. This meant the victim could remain alive, suffering in silence and agony for hours or even days, depending on how the torturers intended the punishment to unfold. It was not just death, it was death prolonged, turned into a drawn-out ritual of pain-dot stories about the Iron Maiden, often connected to Nuremberg, Germany, where one of the earliest references to such a device appears. Accounts from the 18th century describe an Iron Maiden being used there in 1515 against a coin forger. The tale tells that the man was locked inside the spiked cabinet, slowly impaled, and left to die. Whether this account was truly medieval or a later invention to feed public fascination with cruelty is debated, but what matters is how it shaped the memory of the Middle Ages. The Iron Maiden became a symbol of barbaric justice, even if historians suspect it was more legend than fact. Yet while the Iron Maiden itself might have been rare or even mythical, the idea behind it was very real. The Middle Ages knew many ways of combining confinement with injury. There were cages that left people exposed to the elements, spiked collars that forced victims to hold their heads painfully still, and devices that trapped a body in positions of torment. The Iron Maiden was the exaggerated image of these practices, a nightmare object that gathered together the cruelty of its age and presented it in one single horrifying form. It showed not only the possibility of pain, but also the terrifying creativity of those who sought to use suffering as punishment. Psychologically, the Iron Maiden worked even if it was never actually employed. The thought of being locked inside, pressed against steel spikes, bleeding from 100 wounds, left to suffocate in the dark, such images were enough to terrify anyone who heard the story. The Middle Ages thrived on fear as a form of control, and devices like the Iron Maiden, whether real or imagined, were tools of that fear. They demonstrated that rulers and judges had absolute power, not only to punish, but to invent new horrors that went beyond simple execution. By the time the Enlightenment era arrived, writers and collectors of curiosities were fascinated with medieval torture. They displayed reconstructed Iron Maidens in museums, wrote about them in pamphlets, and presented them as evidence of just how far civilization had advanced since those dark times. In this sense, the Iron Maiden became a symbol not just of medieval cruelty, but of progress, a way for later generations to look back and say, we are no longer so barbaric. The irony, of course, is that torture never truly disappeared, only changed its form, whether it stood in a dungeon of Nuremberg or only in the imagination of later centuries. The Iron Maiden remains one of the most infamous torture devices in history. It may never have seen widespread use, but the very idea of it captures the essence of medieval horror. Pain not as a side effect of punishment, but as the punishment itself. The Iron Maiden reminds us that justice in those times was not about truth or fairness. It was about fear, spectacle, and control. And even if it was born more from legend than from fact, it has ensured that the Middle Ages are remembered not only for castles and knights, but also for nightmares forged in iron. The breaking wheel, also known in some chronicles as the Catherine wheel, was one of the most terrifying punishments of the Middle Ages, not just for the pain it inflicted, but for the sheer spectacle it created. Unlike devices hidden in the shadows of dungeons, this torture was often carried out in open squares or on the edge of towns, where the public could gather and watch. The wheel itself was a simple wagon wheel, large enough to hold a human body across its surface. Yet, in the hands of executioners, it became a tool of slow destruction. Its cruelty lay not in complicated mechanics, but in the deliberate and ritualized breaking of bones until the victim was little more than a shattered ruin. To begin the punishment, the condemned person was tied down, usually on a wooden platform. Their arms and legs were stretched across beams, leaving the limbs exposed and vulnerable. Then the executioner would lift an iron bar or hammer and bring it down with brutal precision, smashing bones one by one. Sometimes the blows began at the legs, shattering shin bones and knees before moving upwards. Other times they began with the arms, ensuring the victim could no longer shield themselves even by instinct. The sound of breaking bones echoed through the crowd, snaps, cracks, and muffled screams merging together. After every few strikes, the prisoner might beg for mercy, but mercy was rarely the goal. This was not just punishment. It was a performance. meant to terrify everyone watching. Once the bones had been broken and the body reduced to a twisted shape, the victim was not left to die immediately. Instead, they were often tied to a large wheel, sometimes woven through its spokes. The broken limbs bent at unnatural angles, wrapping around the wood like grotesque ropes. The wheel was then raised upright and fixed onto a pole, leaving the condemned suspended in midair, exposed to the elements and to the gaze of every passerby. Crows and other scavenger birds would circle overhead, waiting for the body to weaken, while villagers and townsfolk would gather to witness what became an unholy form of entertainment. For hours, sometimes days, the victim might remain alive, their body destroyed but their mind still conscious, until death came by shock, blood loss, or simple exhaustion. The breaking wheel was often reserved for the most serious crimes murderers, traitors, and those who had committed acts deemed so heinous that simple execution was not enough. It was about making an example, turning one person's suffering into a warning for thousands. By the end, the body was sometimes left on display for weeks, a skeleton of shattered bones clinging to the wheel, reminding everyone of the price of disobedience. In this sense, the wheel was as much about deterrence as it was about punishment. The sight of a broken body slowly decaying in public was more powerful than any decree or law written on parchment. The psychological impact was immense. Imagine living in a medieval village where news spreads that a wheel execution will be held. Families, children, even traveling merchants might make their way to the site, not because they relished cruelty, but because it was a rare public event. To see justice in action was to understand power, to feel the weight of authority. People whispered among themselves, some horrified, some fascinated, all reminded that no one, no matter their strength or cunning, could escape the law when the wheel was waiting. Yet the wheel was not only about punishment, it was also about ritual. Chroniclers describe how executioners often followed specific patterns, striking joints in a sequence that maximized both suffering and the symbolism of breaking down a criminal piece by piece. Some blows were meant to kill, others to prolong life. The body, once broken, was woven into the wheel almost like a grotesque tapestry. This ritualized destruction turned the act into something more than brutality. It became theater, a grim performance that mixed law, religion, and spectacle. In later centuries, as torture fell out of favor, the breaking wheel remained in memory as one of the most barbaric practices of medieval justice. It was spoken of with horror by Enlightenment thinkers, who condemned it as proof of mankind's darker instincts. Yet at the time it had a logic that was impossible to ignore. The more shocking the punishment, the more powerful the authority behind it appeared. Pain was not only inflicted on the body of the condemned, but also engraved into the minds of everyone who witnessed it. The breaking wheel shows used the essence of medieval punishment, not hidden cruelty, but cruelty performed in daylight, turned into a lesson for society. It was not enough that the criminal die. They had to die in such a way that their body, their screams, their shattered bones told a story to everyone else. It was a story of fear, obedience, and control. And while the wheel may have fallen into the past, its memory still speaks of a time when justice was written not in ink, but in broken bones displayed before the world. Not every form of medieval torture was designed to tear flesh, shatter bones, or bring about death in slow agony. Some methods worked on a different level altogether, psychological, social, and humiliating. The pillory and the stocks, two of the most recognizable punishments of the Middle Ages, were simple devices made of wood, yet they carried immense power. To be locked into one was to be stripped of dignity, exposed to the jeers, laughter, and cruelty of the public. These punishments thrived not in dungeons, but in marketplaces, at town squares, and outside churches, where the entire community could gather and watch. The pillory was essentially a wooden frame, usually mounted on a post, with holes cut out for a person's head and hands. Once secured, the prisoner was forced to stand, bent awkwardly, unable to move or defend themselves. The stocks worked in much the same way, though they confined the feet, sometimes leaving the victim seated or lying down on the ground. Both devices immobilized the body, making the victim a living target for mockery. Unlike the rack or the wheel, which destroyed the body in silence or in front of an awed crowd, the pillory and stocks relied on the cruelty of the public to deliver the real punishment. What made these punishments so effective was their visibility. To be placed in the pillory was to be branded as guilty in front of neighbors, friends, and strangers alike. People passing by were encouraged to shout insults, throw rotten food, mud, or even stones. In some cases, the victim's punishment turned deadly when angry crowds hurled bricks or heavy objects, crushing bones or killing the accused outright. But most of the time, the goal was not death, it was shame. To be locked in the pillory was to lose face, to have one's reputation stripped bare in public, and that was sometimes more damaging than physical wounds. Imagine being accused of petty theft, drunkenness, cheating, or gossip. For hours, maybe even days, you would stand under the open sky, chained into the wooden frame while your community spat at you, laughed, or worse, ignored you entirely. Your humiliation became a performance, a lesson to others who might dare break the rules. Children would point, adults would sneer, and your own neighbors might turn away, unwilling to be associated with you. It was not simply about pain, it was about isolation. The psychological torment was immense. A noble tortured in secret on the rack might still maintain some sense of dignity, but the poor farmer locked in the stocks lost everything in public. This was justice turned into theater punishment, not hidden away, but displayed like a spectacle, meant to reinforce the idea that law and order ruled over every life. No matter how small dot at times, these punishments were combined with physical pain. The victim might be whipped before being placed in the pillory or branded with hot irons while still locked in. Others had their ears nailed to the wooden boards, forcing them to tear themselves free to escape. In certain towns, prisoners in stocks were left overnight, exposed to the cold, rain, or snow, their misery prolonged not by the executioner's hand, but by the indifference of nature and the cruelty of their peers. Perhaps the most chilling element of the pillory and stocks was how much they depended on the crowd. The authorities merely locked the person in place, but it was the people, their neighbors, fellow villagers, and strangers who delivered the humiliation. This turned ordinary citizens into participants in justice, reinforcing their obedience by making them complicit. To laugh, to mock, to throw filth was to join in the system. To refuse to show mercy could raise suspicion, and so the cycle of humiliation repeated, sustained by the very community it punished. For the victims, the aftermath could be devastating. Even once freed, their reputations were stained. A man who had stood in the pillory for theft would forever be known as a thief. A woman who had been mocked for gossip might find herself ostracized. Medieval society thrived on reputation, and a single day in the stocks could destroy a lifetime of trust. In this sense, the punishment outlasted the moment. It clung to the victim like a shadow. Over time, as Europe moved toward new forms of justice, the pillory and stocks lost their place. They became relics of a harsher, more communal form of law enforcement. Yet their memory endures because they reveal a different side of medieval cruelty, where devices like the rack or the wheel aimed to dominate the body, the pillory and stocks aimed to dominate the mind and spirit. They worked not only through pain but through shame, and in a society where honor and reputation meant survival, that could be the deepest wound of all. The pillory and stocks remind us that torture was not always about hidden chambers or secret devices. Sometimes it was as simple as a wooden frame in the middle of town, where the true torment came not from iron spikes or breaking bones, but from the judgment of one's fellow man. And that judgment, shouted in the open air, could echo in a victim's life long after the wooden boards had been unlocked. The Middle Ages were an age of invention, but not all inventions were born out of creativity for art or technology. Some of the darkest creations of that time were designed not to build, but to destroy. Among them, the thumbscrew and the finger crusher stand as haunting reminders of how far humanity could go when pain became a legal tool. They were small compared to the rack or the wheel, easy to carry, easy to conceal, and terrifying in their simplicity. And yet their impact was immense, for they worked on the most vulnerable part of the human body, the fingers, those delicate instruments of daily life filled with nerves and sensitivity. These devices did not need large chambers, heavy wheels, or public displays. They could be used anywhere, in prisons, in interrogation rooms, even on the spot in a marketplace, and they were meant for one purpose alone, to squeeze the truth out of a person, whether that truth existed or not. Imagine being dragged into a dimly lit chamber, not chained to a wall, not stretched across a rack, but simply seated at a wooden table with your hands placed before you. At first, it feels almost merciful. You are not bound in iron, you are not surrounded by spikes. Perhaps you even allow yourself a flicker of hope. But then the torturer brings out a small iron device, almost modest in appearance, something that might look harmless to the untrained eye. It is a set of iron bars with screws attached, designed to close slowly, relentlessly, crushing anything caught between them. They set it over your thumb or finger, turning the screw bit by bit. At first there is only pressure, uncomfortable but bearable. But as the screw tightens, the pain blooms like fire. Nails bend, flesh tears, bones crack under the impossible force. And you realize with horror that this tiny device can make you scream more than any wheel or spike ever could. The genius of the thumbscrew lay in its simplicity. Unlike complex machines that needed to be built and maintained, the thumbscrew was just a block of metal with screws, easily forged by any blacksmith. Its size meant that torturers could carry it from place to place, a portable engine of suffering, ready to be used whenever a confession needed to be extracted. Interrogators prized it because it left the victim alive and able to speak. After all, what use was a confession if the prisoner was too dead to give it? The thumbscrew did not kill quickly, but it did ensure that the victim would say whatever was demanded to make the pain stop. Medieval records show that thumbscrews were often used on those accused of heresy or witchcraft. These were crimes in which proof was scarce and confessions were everything. A man accused of doubting church teachings, a woman whispered to be in league with demons. Such charges rested not on evidence, but on words. And if those words did not come freely, the torturer would place the accused in the chair, set their hand in the device, and begin to turn. Screams filled the air, bones cracked, and soon enough the confession flowed. Whether it was true or false no longer mattered. In the eyes of the law, pain had produced truth. The psychological effect of the thumbscrew was just as powerful as the physical. Unlike the rack or wheel, which destroyed the entire body, the thumbscrew focused on one small, vulnerable part. Victims could see their own fingers crushed before their eyes, the nails turning black, the skin splitting, the bones flattening. It was intimate torture, forcing the victim to watch their own destruction in miniature. Many broke mentally before their fingers were fully destroyed, confessing at the very first turn of the screw, simply to save what little remained of their hands. What made it even worse was that the hands were symbols of livelihood. For peasants, hands meant the ability to till soil, to harvest, to work. For craftsmen, hands meant life itself, the ability to carve, sew, hammer, or weave. To destroy a person's fingers was not just to inflict temporary pain, it was to take away their future, their survival. A broken arm might heal, a scar might fade, but a crushed hand often never recovered. Some victims left interrogation chambers, crippled for life, unable to feed themselves, condemned to poverty or dependence on others. Thus the thumbscrew punished, not only in the moment, but for years to come. Finger crushers existed in many variations. Some devices could crush all the fingers at once, using iron bars that came down together. Others targeted individual digits with screws. Some were elaborate with serrated edges that tore the skin as the pressure mounted. A few even had spikes inside so that as the bones broke, the flesh was punctured at the same time. The variety shows how widespread and adaptable the idea was. As long as there was a need for pain, there was a way to design a tool to deliver it. Historians note that such devices were not limited to one country. They appeared across Europe, from the dungeons of Spain to the castles of Germany and the courts of Scotland. In each place, they served the same function: to break the will of the accused and to provide evidence in the form of confessions. In some cases, multiple tortures were combined. A prisoner might first be placed on the rack, then have their fingers crushed, then be threatened with fire. Each stage was designed to wear down resistance until nothing remained but compliance. One of the darkest aspects of the thumbscrew was its efficiency. Unlike executions that required an audience or torture devices that demanded large spaces, the thumbscrew could be used quickly, quietly, and repeatedly. A prisoner might undergo multiple sessions in a single day, their fingers slowly destroyed. One by one, the torturer could stop at any moment, revive the victim with water or rest, and then resume turning the screw. This gave interrogators total control, not only over the victim's body, but over their very sense of time and endurance. There are recorded accounts of prisoners confessing to absurd crimes under the torment of finger crushers, admitting to flying through the night on broomsticks, meeting with demons, or conspiring against kings when no such acts had ever occurred. But in the logic of the Middle Ages, such confessions were valid. Pain had spoken, and pain was the closest thing to truth. The fact that it destroyed countless innocent lives was of little concern. The system cared less about justice than about obedience and fear. To picture the aftermath of such torture is chilling. Victims left the chamber with hands swollen, bloody, and twisted, sometimes nothing more than useless claws. They could no longer grip tools, hold weapons, or write letters. Their scars branded them forever as people who had once stood accused, people who had broken under interrogation. Even if they survived the legal ordeal, they carried the memory of the screws in every painful movement of their ruined fingers. And in a world where physical ability meant survival, such an injury was as good as a death sentence. The thumbscrew and finger crusher were proof that cruelty did not need to be large to be effective. They were not grand devices of iron and wood, towering over prisoners. They were small, almost unremarkable, yet capable of reducing the strongest of men to tears and confessions. In their simplicity, they revealed the essence of medieval torture, the belief that pain could bend reality, that agony could transform lies into truth, and that the body was a tool to be broken in service of authority. In the centuries that followed, the thumbscrew became a symbol of tyranny. Enlightenment thinkers pointed to it as an example of barbarism, proof that earlier times had been savage and inhumane. Museums displayed reconstructed versions, inviting the public to imagine the suffering of those whose hands had been crushed. Within, even today, the phrase "put the screws on someone" survives in English as a metaphor for pressure and coercion, a linguistic ghost of the torture chambers of the past. Yet we should not dismiss the thumbscrew merely as a relic of cruelty. It teaches us something deeper about the psychology of power. Authority in the Middle Ages did not rely only on armies or castles. It relied on the ability to instill fear in every individual. The thumbscrew did not need to kill. It only needed to make the threat of pain so vivid, so intimate, that resistance collapsed before it began. It was the perfect tool for a world where obedience was demanded at all costs. The story of the thumbscrew and finger crusher reminds us that torture does not have to be spectacular to be devastating. Sometimes the smallest device, turning slowly on a single finger, can be more effective than all the wheels and spikes in the world. It is a story of how the Middle Ages used pain as a language, forcing confessions through screams, and how the echoes of that language still linger in the way we think about pressure, coercion, and control today. Water, the very substance that sustains human life, was turned into a merciless weapon in the Middle Ages. To most people, it represented purity, survival, and even spiritual cleansing. But inside the chambers of interrogation, it became a medium of terror used to suffocate, disorient, and destroy the human body and mind without leaving the obvious marks of fire or iron. Water tortures were among the most insidious practices of medieval justice because they played not only on physical pain but also on the primal fear of drowning. Every human being knows the panic that comes when breath is cut short, when the lungs scream for air, when water floods into the throat. Torturers understood this instinctive terror, and they used it with precision, knowing it would shatter even the strongest will. The practice of water torture took many forms. Some were brutally simple, involving nothing more than forcing a victim to drink beyond the capacity of their body. In dungeons across Europe, prisoners were bound tightly, their heads tilted back, and water was poured relentlessly into their mouths. At first, the victim coughed and choked, their body resisting the flood. But as more liquid poured in, the stomach swelled painfully, stretching beyond its limits. The victim convulsed, begged, and gasped between gulps that could not be avoided. It was not merely thirst quenched, but thirst reversed into agony, the very essence of water transformed into an instrument of torment. Those who endured this punishment often vomited violently or lost consciousness, only to be revived and subjected to the ordeal again. In many cases, the internal damage was lasting, rupturing organs or breaking the body's natural balance. Another common variation was the controlled drowning technique. The prisoner was restrained, often tied to a board or table, their face tilted upward. Cloth was placed over the mouth and nose, and water was poured over it in steady streams. The fabric clung tightly to the face, making each breath impossible, while the flow of water convinced the body that drowning was already underway. The victim thrashed against the restraints, lungs burning for air, mind spiraling into panic. The torturer could pause at any moment, allowing just enough breath for survival before resuming the flood. Unlike the wheel or the rack, which relied on visible destruction, this method left few outward marks. The scars were invisible, carved into the psyche of the victim, haunting them with nightmares long after the water had dried. Accounts from inquisitorial records describe water torture as one of the favored methods for extracting confessions from suspected heretics and witches. Fire and iron left too many signs that could arouse sympathy or scandal, but water seemed almost clean, as if the torment was carried out not with brutality, but with some twisted form of ritual purity. Authorities claimed they sought truth, not death, and so the use of water appeared in their eyes to be justified. Yet to the victims it was pure terror, a death experienced again and again without release. Consider the psychology of such torment. To be stretched on the rack or burned by fire was agonizing, but at least the victim knew the source of the pain. Water torture, by contrast, attacked the very instinct to breathe. It robbed the victim of control, creating the sensation of drowning in slow motion. The panic was overwhelming, primal, uncontrollable. Even the bravest warrior, the most devoted heretic, could not resist the terror of suffocation. Breath is life itself, and water torture turned life's foundation into a weapon. Cruelty extended beyond the physical session. Survivors often suffered long afterward. The stomachs of those forced to drink too much water remained bloated and painful, sometimes permanently damaged. Their throats burned, their lungs wheezed, and many developed an enduring fear of water itself. Even the sound of pouring liquid or the sight of a bucket could trigger shivers of remembered agony. In societies where wells, rivers, and rain were part of daily survival, such fear was inescapable. The torture followed them everywhere, invisible but constant. Water could also be used in other humiliating ways. In some towns, prisoners were dunked repeatedly into rivers or ponds, tied to wooden beams, dragged beneath the surface again and again until they confessed or drowned. These ordeals were often disguised as tests of guilt or innocence, especially in cases of witchcraft. The belief was that water, being pure, would reject a witch, causing them to float while the innocent would sink. Yet whether one floated or sank, the ordeal was deadly. Many accused witches drowned outright, while those who survived were often dragged out only to face other forms of execution. In this way, water was not only a method of torture but also a stage for ritualized death. What made water torture especially sinister was its adaptability. It did not require massive devices or elaborate setups. A jug of water, a piece of cloth, a pond, or a rope was enough. It could be used in dungeons, in courts, or in the open air. It required little preparation, yet delivered immense fear. This made it one of the most versatile tools of interrogation, favored by inquisitors and jailers across Europe. In many ways, it was the perfect medieval torture, cheap, effective, terrifying, and leaving few visible scars. The cultural memory of water torture was powerful. Tales spread quickly from victim to victim, from village to village, that water could make a person confess anything. People whispered of prisoners who admitted to impossible crimes, to conspiracies they never joined, to pacts with demons they never made. The confessions were accepted not because they were true, but because they were born from suffering. In a society where pain was equated with honesty, water was the key that unlocked any story the authorities wanted to hear. In the broader sense, water torture reveals how medieval justice was less about discovering facts and more about enforcing obedience. The goal was not truth but submission. When a victim gasped, screamed, and finally yielded under the flood, the interrogators did not care if the words were. What mattered was the display of authority, the proof that no one could resist the will of the rulers. The water, in its cruel irony, washed away not sins or lies, but the very possibility of resistance. Over time, as the Enlightenment spread and torture was increasingly condemned, accounts of water torment were used to illustrate the barbarity of the past. Writers described with horror how something as innocent as water had been twisted into a tool of suffering. Yet even then, the practice did not vanish completely. Later centuries, even in modern times, would revive the same methods under different names, proof that the logic of pain outlasting words still tempted those in power. The story of medieval water tortures is one of perverse transformation. That which gives life was turned into death's shadow. That which cleansed was made to defile. That which sustained communities was twisted into an intimate weapon of fear. Unlike the Iron Maiden or the breaking wheel, which stood as symbols of brute force, water torture was subtler, quieter, almost invisible in its cruelty. And perhaps that is why it was so effective, because it attacked not only the body but the very essence of being alive, the desperate need to breathe, to imagine. Enduring such torment is to confront one of humanity's deepest fears. It was not fire that burned away defiance, nor iron that crushed the spirit, but the slow, suffocating flood of water that convinced countless men and women to surrender, to confess, to break. In that sense, water was not simply a weapon of torture. In the Middle Ages, it was the ultimate reminder that even life's most Essential elements could be corrupted into instruments of fear and domination. Few things in the medieval imagination carried as much symbolic weight as fire. Fire was warmth in a peasant's hut, the heart of the hearth, the light in endless nights of darkness. It was also destruction, devouring crops, villages, and forests, with the same relentless hunger. In religion and folklore, it was the element of purification, the eternal punishment of sinners, the boundary between sacred and profane. But in the courts and dungeons of the Middle Ages, fire was stripped of all metaphor and turned into a tool of absolute cruelty. Where water suffocated, fire burned. Where the rack stretched, fire consumed. It was one of the most primal and effective ways to break a person's body and spirit. To be condemned to fire was not simply to face death, but to endure a punishment that seared both flesh and memory, leaving scars visible to all, or reducing bodies to ash that scattered with the wind. Branding and burning were widespread forms of punishment across medieval Europe. They served not only to torment the accused, but also to send messages that resonated long after the screams had faded. Branding, in particular, was a punishment that outlasted the act itself. An iron rod, heated until it glowed red, was pressed against the skin, sometimes the hand, sometimes the cheek, sometimes directly across the forehead. The hiss of burning flesh was as unforgettable as the stench it released, and the mark it left was permanent. In an era where identity was reputation, to carry a brand was to be condemned for life. A thief branded with the letter T, a heretic, with a cross seared into the face, or a runaway servant with a mark on the cheek. Such symbols were living reminders of guilt, impossible to hide, announcing to all that this person had once stood guilty before authority. The ritual of branding was as important as the act itself. Often it took place in public squares, with villagers summoned to witness the punishment. The accused would be bound or forced to kneel, the executioner raising the iron tongs from the fire. The sight of glowing metal was enough to make children cry and grown men pale. As the rod descended and touched flesh, the crowd would murmur, gasp, or shout. Some out of pity, others out of satisfaction. For rulers, this was the essence of fire's power. It punished one and warned 1,000. It was theater, a performance of law etched into the bodies of the condemned. Yet branding was only the beginning. Fire was also used in interrogations. Prisoners suspected of heresy, witchcraft, or treason were sometimes subjected to burning as a means of forcing confessions. Executioners applied heated irons to the soles of the feet or the palms of the hands, places thick with nerves. Victims writhed against their chains, the air filling with the sharp scent of singed skin. The torturer could touch lightly, creating agony without permanent damage, or press deeper, blistering flesh, ensuring scars that never faded. Like the thumbscrew, the goal was not necessarily death, but confession through unbearable pain. And fire, more than almost any other element, had the power to reduce the strongest resolve to ashes. Then there was the ultimate sentence execution by burning. This was reserved for crimes deemed not only illegal but impure, acts that corrupted the body and soul of society. Witchcraft, heresy, sodomy, treason. These were sins that, in the eyes of the medieval world, demanded not just death but purification by flame. To burn a body was to erase it utterly, to deny it burial in consecrated ground, to make of it a warning visible for miles. The execution would be staged in public, a wooden stake driven into the earth, a pile of kindling stacked high. Around the condemned, the crowd gathered, not just to see justice, but to feel it, to smell the smoke and watch the flames climb higher, to carry the memory home as a story retold again and again. The condemned might be strangled or hanged before the fire was lit. Mercy granted in some places to spare the victim the agony of being burned alive, but often, particularly in witch trials or heresy prosecutions, the fire consumed the living. Bound to the stake, the victim screamed as flames licked at their feet, rising up the legs, devouring clothing and skin alike. The smoke choked, the heat blistered, and the crowd watched as flesh blackened and curled. To see such a death was to witness more than punishment. It was to experience fear turned into spectacle. Children clung to their parents, adults prayed silently, and all were reminded of the power of law and church to destroy body and soul alike. The use of fire extended even into humiliation. Some punishments involved holding a candle or torch close to a prisoner's skin until they winced and burned, a lesser form of torment meant to frighten rather than kill. Others involved branding tools designed not only to mark but to shame. Executioners created iron stamps with specific shapes or letters, leaving not just scars but messages: thief, liar, traitor. These became permanent advertisements of guilt, visible every day to anyone who looked. Unlike imprisonment or fines, branding was a punishment that followed the victim forever. For the rulers and inquisitors, fire carried symbolic power beyond mere pain. It was seen as purification, as a way of cleansing corruption through flame. Burning a witch was not just killing her. It was believed to be sending her soul to the judgment of God, freeing the community from her corruption. Burning a heretic destroyed the body and erased the dangerous ideas that body carried. Branding with fire created not only scars but lessons for others. Let no one dare repeat this crime, for the mark will follow them forever. But for the victims, fire was terror in its purest form. Unlike the rack or the wheel, where the destruction of the body was mechanical, fire felt alive. Flames moved unpredictably, licking and biting, growing or shrinking with the wind. A victim tied to the stake could watch the fire spread, hear the crackle of wood, feel the heat building before the pain even began. It was a slow, relentless approach, a death that announced itself long before it arrived. Few torments inspired such primal dread. Survivors of branding carried their punishment not only on their skin, but in their souls. Some were ostracized, unable to marry or work, shunned by neighbors who saw the mark as a curse. Others wore their scars with defiance. But the stigma remained, a reminder that they had once stood powerless before fire. In this way, fire punished, not only in the moment, but across lifetimes, burning itself into the fabric of medieval society by the time torture and execution by fire began to decline. During the Enlightenment, its memory had already cemented itself in history. Writers condemned it as barbaric. Artists depicted it as proof of cruelty, and generations looked back with horror at the thought of flesh consumed in public squares. Yet the fascination never vanished. Even today, the phrase trial by fire, or branded for life, echoes the medieval practices that once turned flame into law The story of fire and branding in the Middle Ages is one of paradox. Fire gave warmth, but it also gave pain. It cooked meals, but it cooked human flesh. It lit churches and hearths, but it lit the pyres of the condemned. It was a reminder that every tool, every element, every gift of nature could be twisted into an instrument of fear. Fire was not simply a punishment. It was a message written in smoke and scars, a message that echoed across villages and cities alike. Disobey, and you too will feel the flames. Among the endless catalog of medieval torture devices, few capture the strange mixture of cruelty and cold practicality, quite like the torture chair, often called the chair of nails or the iron chair. At first glance, it resembled something ordinary, a chair heavy and solid, with a back, seat, arms, and legs. Yet upon closer inspection, the truth revealed itself. Hundreds of iron spikes covered every surface where flesh might rest. The seat bristled with points. The armrests gleamed. With sharp edges, even the back and sides were lined with cruel steel. It was not meant for comfort. It was meant for a living body to be placed upon it, forced to sit in agony so total that even breathing became torment. The idea was as simple as it was horrifying. A victim was dragged into the chamber, stripped of clothing, and pressed down onto the chair. Straps of leather or iron shackles bound the arms, legs, chest, and sometimes even the head, ensuring there was no escape. Once secured, the victim's own weight did the work. Flesh pressed into spikes, puncturing skin, drawing blood at every point of contact. Unlike other tortures that relied on beating or stretching, the chair turned stillness itself into suffering. Every twitch, every attempt to shift and relieve pressure only drove the spikes deeper. Even the act of breathing, the rise and fall of the chest-pushed skin against the barbed surface. Sitting became an act of destruction. There were variations of the device. In some regions, the spikes were heated before use, glowing red so that as the victim sat bound, their flesh not only pierced but burned. In others, small holes were drilled into the spikes, allowing executioners to connect tubes of fire or hot coals, ensuring that the body roasted slowly while impaled. Some chairs contained as many as 1,500 individual points, covering not only the seat and back, but even the footrest and headrest, so that no inch of the victim's body was spared. The design showed both a grim ingenuity and a relentless focus on prolonging agony. It was not quick death the torturers sought. It was confession, fear, and spectacle. The chair was often used in judicial interrogations, particularly in trials of heresy and witchcraft. A woman accused of speaking with demons, a man whispered to be plotting treason, a merchant suspected of fraud. Any could find themselves strapped into the chair. The victim was not expected to endure long before confessing. Many cried out within. Moments, the spikes tearing into sensitive areas, blood running down their legs and arms. Yet the torment could be drawn out for hours, even days. Executioners would sometimes release the victim, allow them to rest, then return them to the chair again, reopening wounds, deepening scars, pushing the body to the brink of collapse. The psychological effect of the chair was as devastating as the physical. Imagine being forced into such a device, feeling hundreds of sharp points pricking your skin simultaneously, knowing that every movement only worsens the pain. The victim could see the spikes, feel them pressing relentlessly, understand that Escape was impossible. The torture was not only in the body but in the mind, as fear magnified every sensation. Prisoners sometimes broke down before being fully strapped in, confessing at the mere sight of the chair, their imaginations already supplying the horror of what awaited. What made the chair especially effective in the eyes of interrogators was its combination of visible and invisible punishment. On one hand, it produced obvious wounds, bloody punctures that left the victim disfigured, sometimes crippled. On the other hand, it left no clear method of destruction beyond the victim's own body pressing against spikes. To onlookers, it seemed as though the condemned were merely seated, their suffering invisible until screams filled the chamber. This duality made the chair a perfect tool for instilling fear both in individuals and in communities that whispered of its existence. In some regions, the torture chair became part of public executions. Condemned criminals were seated upon it in marketplaces, their cries echoing over cobblestones as villagers gathered to watch. The chair, raised on a platform, turned a man or woman into a living warning, their agony displayed openly as a lesson. Children learned early to associate crime with pain. Adults learned to fear authority. And all were reminded that the law was backed not only by words, but by instruments of steel. The aftermath of such torture was grim. Survivors carried scars across their bodies, countless small puncture wounds that never fully healed. Infection was common, as iron spikes drove dirt and rust deep into the skin. Some lost the use of limbs, unable to walk or lift objects after days of sitting bound. Others carried psychological scars, haunted by nightmares of being strapped down again, unable to move, unable to escape. The chair had a way of breaking not only the flesh, but the very sense of self. To sit upon it was to become powerless in the most absolute way, transformed into an object of pain, stripped of humanity. The chair also reveals much about the philosophy of punishment in the Middle Ages. Where the rack or wheel focused on destruction, the chair focused on endurance. It turned time itself into a weapon, forcing the victim to live through every second of agony. It also blurred the line between torture and execution. Some victims were released alive, crippled but confessing, while others never left the chair, leading out upon its spikes or roasted alive by its heated frame. In this way, it served as both instrument of interrogation and instrument of death, adaptable to whatever the authorities desired. By the enlightened descriptions of the torture, chair spread through Europe, recounted by travelers, historians, and moralists who pointed to it as proof of medieval barbarity. Museums displayed reconstructed versions, rows of iron spikes gleaming under lantern light, horrifying and fascinating visitors in equal measure. Writers used it as a metaphor for cruelty, the image of a man seated upon nails becoming shorthand for absolute suffering. Even today, the phrase, "sitting on pins and needles," echoes faintly of the chair's legacy. Though now stripped of its bloody reality, the chair of nails demonstrates the terrifying creativity of an age where pain was considered proof and fear was considered justice. It was not an accident of history, but a deliberate construction, designed with patience and precision to exploit the most basic truths of the human body, that sitting is unavoidable, that stillness becomes unbearable, that every breath is tied to movement, and that when the body cannot escape, the mind collapses. It turned rest into torment, breath into pain, existence itself into punishment. In the story of medieval torture, the chair stands as a reminder that cruelty does not always roar with fire or thunder with broken bones. Sometimes it whispers, quietly and steadily, through the prick of countless spikes, through the slow bleed of wounds, through the agony of a prisoner forced to endure not minutes but hours of living death. The chair of nails was agony in every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of being alive. And in that endless pain it achieved what it was designed for: silence broken by confession, defiance broken by fear, humanity broken by steel. Among all the brutal practices of the Middle Ages, there are few punishments as haunting, as viscerally horrifying as the act of flaying alive. To be burned was to be consumed by fire. To be stretched was to be torn by ropes. But to be flayed was to be slowly unmade, stripped of the very skin that held the body together. Flesh without its covering is raw, exposed, vulnerable. Skin is not just protection. It is identity, the surface by which we are recognized, the layer that separates you from the world. To have it peeled away inch by inch was more than death, it was erasure. The mere mention of the punishment inspired dread across medieval Europe, for everyone knew that this was not a quick execution, but a spectacle of torment, a suffering designed to be both seen and remembered. Imagine the scene: a prisoner condemned for treason or sacrilege, dragged into the public square, chained upright before a gathered crowd. The executioner approaches, not with a sword or an axe, but with knives honed to cruel sharpness. The crowd holds its breath, waiting as the first cut is made. A shallow incision across the arm or down the chest, separating skin from muscle. The victim cries out, jerks against the chains, but there is no escape. The executioner works patiently, methodically sliding the blade beneath the skin, peeling it back as though stripping bark from a tree. Blood wells, muscles twitch, nerves scream. And yet the victim remains alive, forced to endure every moment, forced to feel themselves unraveling. The practice of flaying was not unique to medieval Europe. It had ancient precedents found in Assyria, Persia, and even in Roman punishments for rebels. But in the Middle Ages, it carried symbolic weight that magnified its cruelty. To flay a person was not just to kill them, but to mark their crime as so severe that they did not even deserve to remain whole. Traitors were common targets. In England, Scotland, and France, men who betrayed their kings or lords might be sentenced to flaying, their skins nailed to city gates as a warning to others. The body was destroyed, but the skin remained, turned into a grotesque banner of obedience. To pass beneath a gate covered in human hide was to remember that loyalty was life and betrayal was a fate worse than death. Religious crimes also invited such punishment. Those accused of desecrating holy spaces or mocking sacred symbols could be flayed as a demonstration that the law of God and Church would tolerate no insult. In some cases, blasphemers had their tongues cut out before being flayed, silencing their voices forever. The punishment was thus both physical and symbolic, stripping away not only the body's protection, but also its dignity. It erased the individual, leaving only suffering and a message of fear. What made flaying so devastating was its slowness. Unlike hanging, which could end in minutes, or beheading, which ended in seconds, flaying could last for hours. Executioners were skilled in prolonging the ordeal, avoiding major arteries so that the victim did not bleed out too quickly. They worked section by section, peeling back skin from arms, chest, legs, and even the face. Some accounts describe victims left alive long enough to see their own skin displayed before them, a final act of cruelty that shattered the mind before the body finally collapsed. There was no dignity, no hope, no escape, only the endless tearing of what was once whole. For the spectators, flaying was unforgettable. Children were brought to watch. Merchants paused their trade. Villagers crowded the square. Some wept, others cheered. All understood the message. The ruler's power was absolute, and treachery would be met with horrors beyond imagination. In a world where oral storytelling carried news faster than letters, tales of such punishments spread quickly. One man flayed in a city square could terrify villages miles away. The memory carried by word of mouth as surely as the skin nailed to a gate. The psychological impact extended even further. To live in a society where flaying existed was to live under constant shadow. Even if most would never see it firsthand, the idea itself was enough to shape obedience. People obeyed not only out of loyalty, but out of fear of ending up stripped alive. Their bodies turned into lessons for others. The punishment's brutality was its strength. It did not need to be common to be effective. The rarity of its use only made it more terrifying, reserved for the worst crimes, the most hated criminals, the gravest insults to authority. The symbolism of skin made the punishment uniquely potent. Skin was identity, recognition, humanity itself. To take it away was to reduce a person to something less than human. It was annihilation in stages, and for rulers that was the point. They did not want only to kill. They wanted to destroy utterly, to ensure that nothing remained but a cautionary tale. The skin on the city gates was a signature, a mark of power more enduring than any written decree. Survivors of partial flaying rare, as they bore lifelong scars, both physical and psychological. The pain of losing skin was unbearable, but the shame of bearing mutilated flesh in public was equally destructive. These men and women were reminders of the punishment's effectiveness, walking testaments to suffering. For communities, seeing them was enough to reinforce obedience without further need of violence. As Europe moved toward the Renaissance and Enlightenment, flaying fell out of use, condemned as barbaric, excessive, unworthy of civilized societies. Yet its memory endured in chronicles, paintings, and myths. Writers pointed to it as the darkest example of medieval cruelty, a punishment so horrifying that it seemed to belong more to nightmares than to reality. Still, its very existence shows us how deeply fear was woven into the fabric of justice. Where laws could not persuade, terror could. And nothing terrified more than the thought of being peeled alive under the eyes of one's neighbors. Flaying alive was not simply torture, it was transformation. It turned the body into a message, the skin into a text, the pain into a performance. It was justice rewritten in blood, authority enforced by agony, obedience carved into flesh. In its slow, methodical cruelty, it revealed the deepest truth of medieval power. That control was not about fairness, but about fear. And when fear was needed, no price was too high, no suffering too great. No punishment too unimaginable. To be flayed alive was to lose everything: skin, dignity, identity, humanity itself. It was to become an object, a warning, a story retold for generations. It was the ultimate fate that hung over the Middle Ages like a shadow, a reminder that justice then was not about truth, but about domination. And for those who endured it, death was not the end, but the long, agonizing journey of being unmade, one strip of skin at a time. Of all the strange and terrible devices said to haunt the torture chambers of the Middle Ages, none has provoked quite as much fascination and dread as the pair of anguish. It was small, deceptively simple, and yet its very design suggested a cruelty that seemed almost surgical. Unlike the rack, which dominated a room, or the wheel, which displayed its horror to an audience, the pair was intimate, hidden inside the body of the victim. It was not about spectacle, but about humiliation and inward torment, pain inflicted in silence. And that, perhaps, made it all the more terrifying. The device was made of metal, usually iron or bronze, shaped like a pear, hence its name. But instead of soft flesh and sweetness, this pear opened with a mechanism of screws and hinges. At rest, it was narrow, small enough to be inserted into a mouth, a rectum, or a vagina. Once inside, however, the torturer would twist a screw at the base. The pear's 4 leaves would slowly expand outward, pressing against the most sensitive parts of the human body. The more the screw turned, the wider the device grew, until the victim's flesh stretched and tore. It was a pain unlike burning or beating. It was the agony of being ripped from the inside out. What set the pair of anguish apart was its precision. It targeted the most vulnerable, private parts of the body, turning them into instruments of shame. To have one forced into the mouth meant a jaw dislocated, teeth shattered, throat bruised. To have one placed in the rectum or vagina meant unbearable pain, often accompanied by permanent injury, bleeding, and infection. The torture was not always fatal, but it was always degrading. In a society where honor and reputation were as important as survival, the humiliation was as deliberate as the suffering. The pair was most often linked to crimes of morality. Women accused of infidelity or blasphemy, men accused of sodomy, heretics, accused of speaking against the church, all could face the pair. The choice of where the device was applied often reflected the supposed crime. A liar might be silenced by having it forced into the mouth. A woman accused of witchcraft or adultery might be subjected to vaginal use. Homosexual men, condemned by both secular and church law, were subjected rectally. In each case, the punishment was not only physical, but symbolic, an assault aimed at destroying both body and dignity. Imagine the process. A prisoner is bound, stripped, trembling as the torturer produces the pair. It gleams in the torchlight, its metallic form almost delicate in appearance. But as the screw is turned, the petals open wider and wider, a mechanical flower blooming. In darkness, the victim thrashes, screams, begs, but the device is relentless. Every twist deepens the agony, pushing flesh and bone to their limits, threatening rupture. Unlike a blade or a whip, the pair works slowly, silently, each movement of the screw calculated, deliberate, merciless. The victim's cries echo off the dungeon walls, and yet the device itself makes no sound, only the faint grind of metal against metal as the screw turns. The psychological horror was immense. The pair attacked not only the body but the mind, filling victims with shame. Few tortures were so invasive, so intimate, so directed at the parts of life most private. To be forced into such a position stripped away all dignity, reducing the victim to an object of suffering. For women accused of sexual crimes, this added a further layer of cruelty, punishing them not just physically but socially, branding them as dishonored even before death. Historians debate how often the pair of anguish was actually used. Some suggest that many of the surviving examples are later inventions, created in the Renaissance or even later as museum curiosities, rather than true medieval instruments. But whether myth or fact, its presence in the cultural memory speaks volumes. People believed in its existence, whispered its horrors, told stories of victims silenced by a metal flower blooming inside them. In that belief lay its power, for fear does not always need reality to thrive. If it was used, then its effectiveness lay in its adaptability. It was portable, small enough to be carried from one interrogation to another, unlike massive racks or wheels. It was easy to conceal, easy to produce suddenly to shock a prisoner into confession. Its scars were internal, often invisible to the outside world, which meant survivors carried their pain privately, haunted by it in silence. Unlike branding, which marked a person for life, the pair left wounds hidden, secrets whispered only to those who endured them. For the authorities, the pair had symbolic significance. It was a device that punished transgression of boundaries, moral, religious, social. It invaded the body just as the accused was believed to have invaded the moral order. It silenced, humiliated, and broke people without leaving public scars. It was the perfect tool for crimes where shame mattered as much as guilt. To the victim, however, it was hell made mechanical. The expansion of the device was unstoppable once it began, the flesh forced to yield to cold iron. The pain was sharp, tearing, all-consuming, and yet not instantly lethal. Victims often lingered in agony, bleeding and broken, sometimes left alive to suffer infection or death over days. Their silence afterward was as much the goal as their confession silence bought by fear of ever facing the device again. The pair of anguish, whether real or partly myth, embodies the darkest aspects of medieval justice. The merging of physical torture with humiliation, the targeting of both body and identity, the insistence that punishment must not only hurt but disgrace. It reveals how power in that age sought not merely to kill, but to dominate completely, to strip away humanity until nothing remained but obedience or ruin. In the end, the pair stands less as a weapon of war or execution, and more as a symbol of fear. Its small size made it seem almost harmless, but in that modest form lay the threat of unimaginable torment. It was a reminder that suffering did not need to be grand or public to be devastating. It could be hidden, intimate, silent anguish, blooming in secret like a metal flower. There are tortures designed to wound, tortures designed to terrify, and then there are tortures designed to humiliate while destroying the body slowly, inch by inch. Among the devices that stand out in the long catalog of medieval cruelty, none is quite as infamous and unsettling as the Judas cradle. Sometimes called the Judas chair or the cuckold's cradle, it was a simple device in construction yet profoundly horrifying in its function. It was a pyramid, usually made of wood or iron, its point rising like a cruel spike. Around it, ropes, pulleys, and beams supported the victim, and the punishment was both grotesque and intimate. The condemned was lowered down onto the sharp point, impaled through the most private parts of the body, left suspended in pain that was both excruciating and degrading. The Judas cradle was used primarily for those accused of heresy, blasphemy, witchcraft, or sexual crimes. In an age where the body was seen not only as a vessel of flesh, but as a vessel of morality, the choice of impalement through the anus or genitals was deliberate. It was meant to desecrate as much as punish, to break not just the body, but the dignity of the person. To watch someone squirm atop the pyramid was to see them reduced to an object of agony, mocked as much as tormented. Torture in the Middle Ages was never simply about pain. It was about symbolism, spectacle, and control. The Judas cradle embodied all three. Imagine the process. A prisoner, stripped naked, their hands bound behind their back, is brought into a chamber where the device stands waiting. Ropes are tied under their arms, around their waist, sometimes around their legs. The executioners hoist them into the air, dangling above the pointed pyramid. Then, slowly, they lower the victim down until the sharp point presses against the flesh. The descent is controlled, deliberate, as the pyramid tip begins to pierce the body. The victim screams, thrashes, tries desperately to pull away, but the ropes keep them in place. Gravity becomes the torturer, pulling the body down onto the spike, inch by inch, until the point tears deeper and deeper. The agony is unimaginable. Every muscle clenches, every nerve fires with pain. The victim can do nothing to escape, nothing to relieve the torment. Even breathing becomes an effort, as the body twists helplessly atop the pyramid. Some variations of the cradle included sharp edges or ridges along the point, increasing the tearing with every movement. Executioners sometimes smeared the tip with oil or grease, not to ease the suffering, but to ensure the penetration lasted longer, preventing immediate rupture and prolonging the torment. Hours could pass, even days, before the victim succumbed to blood loss, infection, or exhaustion. The Judas cradle was not designed for swift justice. It was designed for slow death and maximum degradation. The humiliation was as important as the pain. In medieval society, sexuality and morality were tightly controlled, and crimes like sodomy, adultery, or witchcraft were seen not only as sins, but as threats to the order of the community. By punishing such crimes with the Judas cradle, the authorities made a statement. The body that transgressed would be punished through the very parts that sinned. The torture was a grotesque parody of morality, turning the body's most private areas into sites of destruction. Spectators would sometimes be invited to watch, mocking the victim as they writhed, turning the torture into both punishment and public theater. That the Judas cradle was also a tool of confession. Interrogators could suspend the victim just above the point, threatening to lower them further unless they admitted guilt. The fear of impalement was often enough to break a prisoner's will, but when confessions were not forthcoming, the torture preceded each inch of descent, accompanied by cries of agony that echoed through the chamber. Unlike branding or flogging, which ended quickly, the cradle could continue indefinitely, the victim's suffering prolonged until they either confessed or perished. What makes the Judas cradle particularly horrifying is its reliance on time and inevitability. The victim was not torn apart by sudden force, not crushed by overwhelming machinery, but destroyed slowly by their own weight, pulled down inexorably by gravity. There was no escape, no possibility of relief. The body itself became the executioner, its weight driving the spike deeper and deeper. It was torture turned into a grim equation. Flesh plus time equaled ruin. Survivors were rare, but those who did live bore lasting scars, both physical and psychological. Internal injuries made life unbearable. Infections set in quickly, and the shame of the ordeal lingered forever. Even whispers of having endured the Judas cradle could ruin a reputation, for the device carried associations of sexual sin and dishonor. In this way, the punishment extended beyond the chamber. It followed the victim into the community, branding them in memory, if not in flesh. Historians debate how widely the Judas cradle was actually used. Some surviving devices in museums may be reconstructions from later centuries, and many accounts are drawn from chronicles written long after the supposed events. Yet even if the cradle was not as common as legend suggests, its place in the imagination of cruelty is undeniable. The very idea of it a pyramid point tearing into the body's most private places is enough to horrify. And in a world where torture was as much about fear as about fact, the story of the cradle may have mattered more than its actual use. Symbolically, the Judas cradle reveals the medieval obsession with controlling the body. It was not enough to kill. The method of death had to reflect the crime. It was not enough to punish. The punishment had to shame. It was not enough to extract truth. Truth had to be forced from the most intimate places of suffering. In this sense, the Judas cradle was the perfect medieval device, painful, humiliating, an unforgettable dot. To imagine sitting upon the Judas cradle is to confront the darkest depths of human cruelty. It is to understand how the Middle Ages fused pain and morality, how they turned the body into a stage upon which authority played out its power. Every scream was proof of dominance, every wound a message to the community, every death a lesson, etched into memory. The Judas cradle was not only a tool of torture, it was a symbol of the world that created it, a world where obedience was demanded, where defiance was crushed, and where even the most private parts of life could become the target of public destruction. The Middle Ages are remembered most vividly for their great engines of torture that pulled, tore, and stretched the human body until it reached the limits of endurance. The rack, the wheel, the ropes, all these conjure images of a body extended. Beyond recognition, joints ripped apart, muscles snapping under pressure. Yet not all devices sought to stretch the body outward. Some turned inward instead, compressing, crushing, folding a person into the smallest possible space. If the rack was about expansion, the scavenger's daughter was about contraction, and in many ways that made it worse. The device itself was deceptively simple. It was usually a strong metal frame, hinged in such a way that it could encircle the victim's body and force it into a crouched, unnatural posture. The prisoner would be bound at the hands, feet, and head, and then the iron frame would be tightened, squeezing the body into a rigid crouch where the knees were drawn up against the chest pressed down toward the thighs, and the head forced forward. It was as though the victim were being folded into themselves, trapped in a vice of their own body. There was no movement, no freedom, only the unrelenting pressure of compression. And the longer the victim remained within the device, the more devastating the effects became. At first, the pain came from muscles screaming in protest, joints straining against positions they were never meant to hold. The knees ached, the back burned, the chest tightened. But as hours passed, the pressure grew unbearable. Blood vessels began to rupture under the strain, causing nosebleeds, bleeding from the ears, sometimes even blood seeping from the eyes. The circulation of blood was cut off, limbs grew numb, and the victim's own body became both prison and executioner. Many fainted, their heads forced forward into their knees, only to be revived and made to endure further. The scavenger's daughter was most closely associated with Tudor England, where it stood in grim contrast to the rack. Both were housed in the Tower of London, both instruments of interrogation and punishment. But where the rack stretched bodies outward, the scavenger's daughter folded them inward. Together they formed a pair, two sides of the same logic of cruelty. It was said that prisoners could be shown both devices and told they would face one or the other, a choice between being ripped apart or crushed within themselves. The psychological impact alone was enough to break many before the devices were even touched. One of the most notorious uses of the scavenger's daughter was against religious prisoners, particularly Catholics under the Protestant monarchy of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, men accused of treason, of conspiring with foreign powers, or of plotting to overthrow the crown were subjected to it. Their confessions, once extracted, were celebrated as victories of justice, though in truth they were victories of pain. The device itself bore a cruel irony in its name. Legend claims it was invented by Sir Leonard Skevington, lieutenant of the Tower, and his surname twisted by popular tongue into scavenger, forever linking him with the machine that folded men into silence. The humiliation of the device was almost as profound as the agony. A man folded into the scavenger's daughter lost all dignity. He was no longer upright, no longer strong, no longer even recognizably human. He was bent, broken, curled like a child in the womb, stripped of power. Onlookers saw not a proud knight or cunning traitor, but a groaning, bleeding figure forced into submission by iron. The image itself was a message. Defy the crown, and you too will be folded into nothing. The effectiveness of the device lay in its endurance. Unlike beheading or hanging, which ended quickly, the scavenger's daughter could be endured for hours or days. Victims often survived, though in broken condition. Their bodies were crippled, their joints damaged, their blood vessels burst. Some never recovered, walking for the rest of their lives as twisted shadows of their former selves. Others were left permanently weakened, unable to stand tall again, their bodies reminders of the crown's power. And for those who died, their end was slow, suffocating as the chest collapsed inward, unable to expand for breath. The symbolism of the device is difficult to miss. The rack represented expansion, rebellion pulled apart, the body stretched outward until it broke. The scavenger's daughter represented the opposite, the crushing weight of authority folding the individual into obedience, reducing them to nothing. Together they told a story about power in the Middle Ages, that it could pull you apart or press you inward, destroy you in any direction it chose. Pain was the language of authority, and the devices were its grammar. The psychological terror was immense. To be threatened with the scavenger's daughter was to imagine oneself folded into agony, bleeding from every opening, gasping for breath. Many prisoners confessed at the mere sight of the frame, the iron gleaming in torchlight. The memory of screams whispered through the tower's halls. The fear of being crushed was as effective as the crushing itself, and that was enough to make the device valuable to interrogators. In later centuries, the scavenger's daughter became infamous as a symbol of Tudor brutality. Visitors to the Tower of London saw it displayed alongside the rack, marveling at the cruelty of an age where such devices were not only invented but used in the service of law. Writers condemned it as barbaric, proof that the pursuit of truth had once relied not on reason but on iron. Yet fascination endured, and the device remained a part of the legend of medieval torture, whispered in tales of cruelty that seemed too grotesque to be true, and yet were. The Scavenger's Daughter reveals the ingenuity of cruelty, the way pain can be inflicted not only by tearing apart, but by forcing inward. It shows that medieval torture was not merely about destruction, but about control, about reshaping the body into a symbol of submission. To sit within its frame was to feel every bone, every muscle, every vein compressed into silence. To endure it was to understand the absolute power of those who commanded it, and to die within it was to become a lesson for all who saw or heard. Rebellion leads only to iron, and iron leads only to ruin. In the story of medieval torture, the Scavenger's Daughter stands as a grim reminder that suffering can take many forms. Some devices roared with fire, some tore with spikes, some drowned with water, but this one crushed with silence, folding a man into himself until nothing remained but pain. It was cruelty by compression, agony by stillness, destruction through the simplest of forces, pressure. And in that pressure, countless lives were broken, countless wills destroyed, countless truths forced from unwilling lips. If there is one punishment that demonstrates the unrelenting brutality of medieval justice, it is the saw. Unlike many of the heavy iron machines of dungeons, the saw was a common, everyday tool. It belonged not to the blacksmith's forge, but to the carpenter's workshop. It was used to cut wood, to build homes, to fashion wagons, to construct the very skeleton of medieval towns. And yet, in the hands of executioners, it was turned into one of the most gruesome instruments of death ever devised. Saw torture was simple, cheap, and horrifyingly effective. It needed no elaborate mechanism, no complex design, just a saw, ropes, and the will to turn labor into agony. The process was cruel in its simplicity. A victim was bound by the ankles, often upside down, suspended with their head pointing toward the ground. Their legs were tied apart, their hands bound tightly behind their back or above their head. Once secured, the executioners placed the saw between the victim's legs and began to cut downward through the body. The blade bit into flesh, muscle, and bone, grinding slowly under the weight of gravity and human strength. Blood poured downward, toward the head, but because the victim was inverted, consciousness lingered longer than it otherwise would have. The heart, working against gravity, pumped blood toward the brain, keeping the victim alive and aware while the saw made it slow. Journey. The cutting rarely ended in one stroke. It was methodical, prolonged, intended to inflict suffering rather than to grant a quick death. Some accounts describe executioners sawing only to the abdomen, leaving the victim alive but mortally wounded, prolonging their agony as long as possible. Others describe the saw moving all the way down to the chest, or even the neck, dividing the body into halves in front of the crowd. It was a spectacle of pain, public and unforgettable. To see a man or woman screaming while a saw chewed through their body was to see authority. Made terrifyingly real. The choice to suspend the victim upside down was not accidental. It maximized the suffering, preventing fainting, keeping the victim conscious longer, forcing them to experience every moment. The inverted position also symbolized humiliation, turning the body into something unnatural, dangling like butchered livestock. It stripped away dignity before the sawing even began, ensuring that the punishment was not only physical, but psychological. The condemned was displayed as helpless meat, fodder for justice, reduced to objecthood in the eyes of the spectators. Saw torture was often reserved for the most serious crimes: treason, murder, witchcraft, or blasphemy. These were not petty offenses, but violations that authorities deemed threats to the very foundation of society. The punishment was thus intended not only to destroy the guilty, but to terrify the innocent. Villagers gathered in squares, markets, or crossroads to watch. Children clung to parents, merchants paused their work, priests prayed aloud, and all eyes fixed upon the execution. The sound of the saw, the sight of flesh parting, the smell of blood, it was a sensory assault that left no one untouched. The lesson was clear. The law's reach was total, and disobedience would not just end life, but end it in horror. The psychological weight of saw torture extended beyond the moment. People who witnessed it carried the memory for years, retelling it to their children and neighbors. The story spread like wildfire, amplifying fear even in those who had never seen it themselves. A single execution by sawing could discipline entire communities, creating obedience through terror. In this sense, the saw was not only a weapon against the body, but a weapon of propaganda, spreading fear more effectively than words or decrees ever could. One of the most chilling aspects of saw torture was its ordinariness. The rack required skilled construction. The Iron Maiden demanded metalwork. The chair of nails involved hundreds of spikes. But the saw was a tool found in every village, every workshop, every farm. Its familiarity made it all the more horrifying. Anyone who had ever seen wood cut knew exactly how the blade worked, how relentless its teeth were. To imagine that same saw applied to flesh was to understand instinctively the suffering it could cause. The very sight of a carpenter's saw could inspire shudders, for people knew it could easily be repurposed for torment. In medieval chronicles, saw torture often appears as a punishment for heresy. Heretics, by defying church doctrine, were seen as cutting themselves off from the body of Christendom. Their punishment mirrored their crime, their own bodies cut apart, their lives sawn down as an example to others. The symbolism was deliberate, reinforcing the idea that spiritual rebellion would be met with physical ruin. In some regions, accused witches were subjected to sawing, their supposed pacts with demons punished with blades that left no room for mercy. Survivors of partial sawing were virtually non-existent. Those who endured the beginning of the punishment were left mutilated beyond recovery, bleeding out from wounds too severe to heal. Death was inevitable, but the path to it was drawn out as long as possible. The executioners controlled the speed of the saw, sometimes slowing deliberately to prolong screams, sometimes pausing to taunt or to let the victim beg for mercy. This deliberate cruelty was part of the performance for punishment in the Middle Ages was not private correction, but public theater, that the humiliation added to the suffering. Bound upside down, exposed, stripped, the condemned lost not only life but dignity. The crowd, often encouraged by officials, mocked, jeered, and shouted. Children might be told to watch carefully, to remember what happens to those who defy the law. It was a lesson engraved in blood and fear, passed from generation to generation. By the time of the Renaissance and later Enlightenment, sawing was condemned as barbaric, cited as evidence of humanity's cruelty in earlier ages. Yet the memory remained. Writers and philosophers referred to it as an example of the worst excesses of punishment. Museums and books displayed illustrations, often exaggerated, of men split in half before horrified crowds. The image of the saw entered cultural memory as a symbol of cruelty, so powerful that even centuries later it provokes shudders. Saw torture shows us a profound truth about medieval justice. It was not about efficiency. It was not about ending life swiftly. It was about creating fear so deep that obedience seemed the only option. The saw turned an everyday tool into a nightmare, a reminder that anything, even the instruments of daily labor, could be twisted into weapons of suffering. To live in such a world was to live under constant threat, where even the simplest tool could become a device of death. In the long catalog of medieval punishments, the saw occupies a place of special horror. It did not rely on complexity, only on cruelty. It used gravity, wood, and steel, the simplest of elements, to create a spectacle of pain. And in doing so, it revealed the essence of the age, that justice was not about fairness, but about fear, that authority was maintained not by persuasion, but by terror, and that death, when it came, was often not a release, but a prolonged performance, for the watching crowd. To be sawn alive was to endure one of the most grisly deaths imaginable. It was to feel every tooth of the blade, to hear the sound of one's own body being cut apart, to hang helpless while the world looked on. It was to become a lesson carved into memory, a story told and retold until obedience became instinct. The saw was not only a tool of carpenters. In the Middle Ages, it was a tool of kings, inquisitors, and executioners, a blade that cut not only wood, but the very spirit of defiance. There are punishments that wound and release, tortures that cripple, but eventually end. And then there are punishments that transform the very act of dying into a long, drawn-out ritual of heat and horror. Among the cruelest of medieval executions was boiling alive, sometimes referred to as cooking alive, where human beings were treated not as souls or citizens, but as meat in a pot. Fire was already a favored weapon of the Middle Ages, used for branding, interrogating, and burning at the stake. But boiling carried with it a different kind of terror. It was intimate, gruesome, and humiliating, reducing a person to the status of food simmering in a cauldron. Their body destroyed slowly in the most primal and undignified way imaginable. The punishment required little: a large cauldron, a vat, or even a giant iron pot, water or oil or pitch to fill it, and a fire to heat it. The condemned was stripped, bound, and lowered into the boiling liquid while crowds watched. Sometimes the victim was dropped in quickly, death arriving in screams and steam. More often, however, they were lowered gradually, inch by inch. The lower body submerged first, the liquid bubbling around the legs, while the upper body still writhed above. The skin blistered instantly. Flesh sloughed off in strips, the smell of burning meat filled the air. The condemned shrieked as the fire ate through muscle, nerves, and bone. The audience recoiled, gagged, or cheered, depending on their appetite for cruelty, but all carried home the memory of the screams. In some cases, boiling was used as interrogation. A prisoner might be forced to dip their hands or arms into scalding. Water to prove innocence or guilt. A trial by ordeal where survival met divine favor. But full-body boiling was a punishment for crimes considered especially heinous. Poisoners were frequent victims, for in many cultures they were seen as uniquely insidious, killing secretly rather than openly. In England, Henry VIII even issued a decree in 1531, declaring boiling alive the proper punishment for poisoners, a law that saw several men and women executed in this manner. Treason, witchcraft, and heresy could also bring about the sentence, for boiling was meant not just to kill but to disgrace. To burn at the stake was to die a fiery martyr's death. To boil alive was to die as food, stripped of dignity, humanity, and honor. The psychological horror of boiling was immense. Fire devours quickly, but boiling lingers. The victim felt every second as liquid bubbled around their skin, as nerves fried, as flesh split and peeled. The body thrashed against the restraints, the pot rattled, steam hissed into the air. Onlookers often spoke of the terrible sounds, the screams mixed with the bubbling of liquid, the popping of skin, the groaning of iron pots under strain. The execution was less a clean act of justice and more a grotesque performance of suffering. What made boiling particularly cruel was its slowness. Unlike a sword stroke which ended life in a flash, or even hanging, which at times killed quickly, boiling deliberately prolonged agony. The executioner could control the speed, lowering the condemned gradually, pausing to let the victim scream, before continuing. Sometimes the liquid was heated slowly with the prisoner already inside, forcing them to feel the gradual rise of temperature, from warmth to burning to unbearable agony. The slow pace turned minutes into eternities, each second more excruciating than the last. The humiliation was just as significant as the pain. To be treated as something cooked was to be dehumanized completely. Villagers cooked animals in pots, stewed meat in cauldrons, boiled food for survival. To see a man or woman subjected to the same process stripped away their humanity, reducing them to nothing more than flesh. The punishment declared that the condemned was not worthy of respect, even in death. Their execution was not simply removal from society. It was transformation into an object of disgust, a warning that the guilty could be unmade as easily as a meal. Survivors of partial boiling, those who had limbs submerged but were pulled out before death, were crippled for life. Their bodies bore scars of bubbling skin, burned muscles, fused joints. Their appearance alone was enough to mark them forever as victims of justice, living reminders of cruelty. Infection often claimed them soon after, for burns were notoriously difficult to heal in an age before medicine. To endure boiling even partially, was to endure a fate almost as terrible as death itself. The crowd played a vital role in boiling. Executions. These were not hidden punishments, but public events meant to terrify entire communities. People gathered in marketplaces, the cauldron placed high enough for all to see. The fire was stoked in full view, the pot stirred like soup, the condemned displayed as though already less than human. Children watched, mothers whispered prayers, men looked on grimly, all reminded that crime and sin carried consequences too, terrible to risk. The sight of flesh cooking was meant to burn itself into memory, ensuring that obedience was not simply expected but compelled by fear. Symbolically, boiling alive carried profound meaning. It was not only about destruction, but about purification through heat, a twisted reflection of religious imagery. Just as metal was purified in fire, so too were sinners supposedly cleansed by boiling liquid. Yet in truth it was not cleansing, but degradation, stripping away not sin, but dignity. It was punishment meant not to save the soul, but to annihilate the body and the reputation in one stroke dot. By the later Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, boiling fell out of favor, condemned by reformers as barbaric and excessive. Yet its memory lingered. Chronicles described it in chilling detail. Moralists pointed to it as proof of mankind's cruelty, and travelers whispered tales of cities where cauldrons had once been used to cook men alive. Even in decline, the punishment cast a long shadow, its legend fueling fear long after the pots had cooled. Boiling alive remains one of the most horrifying examples of how medieval justice blurred the line between execution and spectacle, between punishment and performance. It turned life into stew, body into meat, humanity into object. It was not just about killing, but about sending a message that reverberated across society. Disobey, and you will not merely die, you will be destroyed utterly, cooked before the eyes of your neighbors, your screams echoing above the bubbling cauldron until silence finally swallowed you whole dot in the catalog of medieval tortures. Boiling alive stands as the most grotesque example of heat used as punishment, where fire at the stake could still be cloaked in symbolism of purification. Boiling stripped all meaning away. It was raw, ugly, degrading, and total. It made victims into food, made executioners into cooks, made justice into a feast of fear. And in that transformation lay its power, a power that haunted every man, woman, and child who lived under the shadow of medieval law. When we think of medieval torture, our minds often conjure great machines of horror, the rack stretching limbs until they snapped, the Iron Maiden with its dreadful spikes, the wheel that shattered bodies in public spectacle. These images are dramatic, theatrical, unforgettable. Yet in truth, not every instrument of pain was so elaborate. The executioners of the Middle Ages did not rely only on giant contraptions built with carpentry and blacksmithing. Much of their cruelty came from a simpler source, the small, everyday tools that filled their grim arsenal, tools that could be carried easily, adapted quickly, and applied in countless ways. This toolbox of pain was less about grandeur and more about versatility. The ordinary made monstrous, the simple turned into instruments of fear. The executioner himself was both craftsman and performer, part technician, part actor. His role was to ensure the punishment not only worked but was seen and remembered. To do this, he relied on a collection of devices that might look mundane at first glance, but had been repurposed to torment. Iron pincers heated in the coals became tools for tearing flesh. Whips of leather or rope, sometimes tipped with bits of metal, could scourge skin until it bled in ribbons. Chains and manacles restrained prisoners, but also bruised and broke wrists and ankles when tightened. Branding irons in all shapes and letters seared guilt into skin for life. These were the staples of his craft, used so frequently that they became almost invisible in the great catalogue of medieval cruelty. But to the victims they were unforgettable. Consider the heated pincers used not only to wound but to humiliate. Prisoners were dragged into squares, stripped bare, and their flesh gripped and torn by the glowing jaws. Sometimes the nose or ears were ripped away, sometimes fingers or nipples. The pain was sharp, burning, tearing all at once. The victim's shrieks mingled with the hiss of searing flesh. Onlookers recoiled or jeered. Children remembered for life. For the condemned, this was not just agony, but disfigurement. Their bodies, permanently altered, their humanity scarred away piece by piece. Whips, too, were tools of terror, especially in their more vicious forms. A whip tipped with metal hooks, called a scourge, tore open the back with each strike. Flesh flew, blood sprayed, muscles shredded, until the victim could no longer stand. Public whippings were common punishments for thieves or blasphemers, meant to humiliate as much as to wound. But in dungeons, whips served as preludes to more elaborate torments, softening the body, breaking the will, reminding the prisoner that greater horrors awaited if confession did not come. Then there were the shackles and manacles, instruments of restraint that became instruments of pain. Too tight, and they cut circulation, swelling limbs until the flesh bulged grotesquely. Left on for days, they bit into skin, creating festering wounds, infections that spread. Prisoners chained to walls stood until their legs collapsed, hung until their shoulders dislocated. Left in darkness where the iron gnawed endlessly. To be chained was to be dehumanized, to become part of the wall itself, forgotten until the executioner returned with another tool in hand. Branding irons, meanwhile, combined punishment with permanence. Heated until red-hot, they pressed letters or symbols into the flesh. A thief might bear a T, a heretic a cross, a slave a mark of ownership. The act itself was agony. Hiss, the smell, the screams, but the scar was the true punishment, carried forever. In villages where everyone knew each other, such a mark was a social death sentence, visible proof of crime and shame. No confession, no protest, no claim of innocence could erase what the iron had written. The toolbox also included knives for mutilation, tongues cut from liars, ears from thieves, hands from pickpockets. Each cut carried meaning, linking body parts to crimes. The hand that stole was removed. The tongue that blasphemed was silenced. The ears that listened to heresy were sliced away. The punishment was not random cruelty, but symbolic destruction, turning the criminal's body into a living law book. Each scar and absence a reminder of sin. Even simple ropes served many functions. Prisoners were hoisted by their wrists behind their backs, shoulders wrenching out of their sockets in a torment known as strapado. Others were throttled slowly, the rope tightening until they gasped but did not die, left half strangled for hours. Ropes dragged bodies through streets. tied them to horses, suspended them from trees. Cheap, common, and versatile, rope was one of the executioner's most faithful tools. Fire, too, returned again and again in small ways, not only in pyres or boiling pots, but in torches pressed close to skin, candles held beneath feet, irons heated to glowing. Fire was both spectacle and subtlety, leaving scars on some, devouring others entirely. To the executioner, it was as necessary as rope or chain, part of the basic language of pain. What tied all these tools together was their ordinariness. They did not require massive structures or elaborate preparation. They could be carried, concealed, deployed quickly. They turned the familiar into the terrifying. Every villager who owned a rope, every craftsman who wielded a saw, every farmer who carried a knife knew instinctively how those tools could be twisted into suffering. This made the toolbox powerful, because fear spread not just from stories of great machines, hidden in castles, but from the knowledge that cruelty could be waiting in any object at hand. For the executioner, the toolbox was more than a set of instruments. It was his craft. He had to know which tool broke the will, which left scars, which killed swiftly, which prolonged agony. He had to perform not only for the victim, but for the crowd, turning pain into lessons, screams into law. He was not merely punisher, but educator, teaching obedience through terror. His tools were the vocabulary, his stage the square, his script the cries of the condemned. The victims, meanwhile, carried the marks forever. A branded face, a missing hand, a crooked limb from dislocated shoulders. These became living warnings that walked among their communities. But punishment did not end in the square. It lived on in scars and whispers, in the eyes of neighbors. The executioner's toolbox extended the reach of justice beyond the dungeon, embedding it into daily life. By the time Europe began to reform its justice systems, moving away from torture toward prisons and fines, the toolbox became a symbol of barbarity. Enlightenment thinkers wrote with horror of the casual cruelty of pincers, whips, and branding irons. Museums displayed them as curiosities, proof of how far civilization had advanced. Yet the fascination remained. People looked upon the rusty tools with morbid curiosity, imagining the screams they once produced. Even today, the phrase "put to the rack" or "branded for life" echoes the medieval practice, linguistic relics of the executioner's trade. The executioner's toolbox reminds us that cruelty does not always require complexity. Fear does not need iron maidens or spiked chairs. Sometimes it is enough to take the simplest of tools, ropes, knives, fire, whips, and turn them against the body with imagination and malice. That was the genius of medieval punishment, its ability to make pain out of the ordinary, to twist daily objects into symbols of terror. And in the end, that is perhaps the most terrifying truth. The Middle Ages did not need monsters or magic to enforce obedience. They only needed men with tools, tools that everyone recognized, tools that could be turned in an instant from instruments of life into instruments of death. The executioner's toolbox was not locked away in a dungeon. It was all around. And every object, every tool, every hand that could be wielded for cruelty. To live in that age was to live in a world where suffering was always close, where authority could turn anything into pain, and where the ordinary itself was transformed into a weapon of fear.